Tomorrow night, live at the Royal Albert Hall, Dennis Andrews' defence of his World Light Heavyweight title. And that signals the start of a new series of Sportsnight. Outstanding international action over the next few weeks. Watch out for top-class snooker, rugby league, international soccer with England against Poland in the European Championship. But it's Andrews live tomorrow night, Sportsnight, at the earlier time of 10:05.
And this evening begins on BBC1 at 7 with the game of Trivial Pursuit. Then EastEnders at 7:30, after which we've an hour of comedy with May to December at 8 and On the Up at 8:30. Following the 9 o'clock news, more dramas between the two unlikely brothers, villain and priest, in the Paradise Club. Barry Norman's Film 90 review at 10:20 takes us to 10:50 when Spencer's for hire. And finally, at 11:40, Lady Victoria Leatham visits the medieval Broughton Castle with its airs and graces tonight.
Hello, good afternoon. Members of Wiltshire County Council's Finance Committee have been meeting this morning to discuss cost-cutting plans, which could mean school closures. Chris Vasher has been at the meeting.
The Tory group had asked council officers to find ways of saving £12 million. This morning, what they came up with caused uproar. 8 million cuts in education alone, and including closure of 30 small schools, throwing out primary school meals and shutting 2 old people's homes. The Tories immediately denounced them as too emotive and proposed efficiency savings of less than 2 million in education. They claim the public wouldn't be affected. The opposition parties say that's rubbish. But it does now seem likely that the savage education cuts originally proposed won't go ahead.
Meanwhile, poll tax protesters visited Swindon this morning on their way to London. The demonstrators, who were walking from Bristol to the capital, lobbied employees of Thamesdown Council, who are administrating the area's poll tax. The protesters plan to meet up with others in London later this month for a national rally. A man still under police guard at a hospital in Bristol following the killing of a woman in the Midlands. Police are at Bristol Royal Infirmary, where a 28-year-old man is being treated for a drugs overdose. It's thought police were called in shortly after the man was admitted to hospital at the weekend. 26-year-old barmaid Teresa Band was found strangled in her bed at Redditch in Hereford and Worcester last Thursday. A man's in a critical condition at Taunton's Musgrove Park Hospital this morning after falling from a third-floor window of a block of flats. The man broke his neck and back in the fall from flats in the town's Silver Street. The owners of a garage in Bath, where an explosion and fire killed 2 men last year, have been appearing at Bristol Crown Court this morning. Daniel Sacco and Ian Barton are being prosecuted by the Health and Safety Executive. The Lansdowne Mazda garage was destroyed by the explosion and subsequent fire last October, where 2 workmen were killed. The alleged offences relate to the draining of a car petrol tank. Police in Somerset are appealing for help in tracing a girl who's aged about 5 who was seen walking with a man in suspicious circumstances. The adult was seen arriving by car with the girl at a field in the village of Road near Frome, but he apparently left without her. Police found nothing when they searched the area, but now want to try and trace the people involved. Directors of Bristol Rovers Football Club have been meeting officials from Bristol City Council all morning in an attempt to find a site for a new stadium. The meeting's just broken up, but it's not known yet if any decision has been reached. A look at the weather forecast now. It'll be a mainly cloudy afternoon with some occasional bright spots around the region. There'll be a few spits of drizzle, though. Top temperatures will be around 15 degrees Celsius. That's 59 degrees Fahrenheit.
Harold's relationship with Robin blossoms in Neighbours this afternoon. That's in half an hour here on BBC1.
The 1 o'clock news from the BBC with Laurie Mayer.
Good afternoon. One of the 2 men shot dead in Northern Ireland overnight is believed to have been a known IRA assassin. The shooting in Armagh may have been part of a long-term undercover operation by the army. 3 more Palestinians die in Jerusalem. The city is braced for more violence. At the Conservative conference in Bournemouth, party chairman Kenneth Baker declares an election in 91 or 92 will still leave the government blue. A waste of money? Critics claim a new plant at Sellafield to reprocess nuclear waste could lose £2 billion a year. And imagine John Lennon would have been 50 today. Fans sing his birthday praise. Security sources in Northern Ireland suggest that one of the 2 men shot dead by the army last night is Desmond Grew, a leading IRA gunman. He and another man were killed just after midnight when troops took on an armed gang near the village of Loch Gall in County Armagh. 3 others were arrested. It's understood that a derelict farmhouse close to Loch Gall had been under surveillance. Local people heard several bursts of gunfire. Loch Gall has seen violence before. Last month, a huge IRA bomb devastated the police station there, and 3 years ago, 8 IRA men on a bombing mission were shot dead by the SAS.
There are still very few details of what exactly happened in the incident at these farm buildings early today. All the security forces will say is that an army patrol confronted an armed gang. 2 of them were shot dead and the others, one of them a woman, were arrested. 3 rifles were seized by the security forces. The area will remain cordoned off for some time yet. Army bomb experts will check the scene for explosives before detectives and forensic teams move in. It seems more and more likely that this was some kind of undercover army operation, a tactic the security forces have increasingly had to adopt, particularly in countryside like this. Local people said that after several bursts of gunfire, orange flares were fired and a helicopter was quickly on the scene, suggesting that some kind of undercover operation had indeed been going on. One of the men killed, Desmond Grew, who was aged 37, had served prison terms both in Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. His brother Seamus was shot dead by police in 1982. A Republican terrorist group, the INLA, said he was one of their members. Some local politicians were in no doubt today that Desmond Grew was a leading member of the IRA.
Well, I think anybody who knows Grew will realise that he was a deadly killer. He was in the same class as Seamus McElwain and James Lina. He would show no mercy. He certainly would not be easily captured. He would have been one who would have fought his way out of an ambush if he had the chance. He was a man with whom you could certainly take no risks.
One of the other men mentioned by Ken McGuinness, James Lina, was also shot dead in Loch Gall, another undercover operation by the security forces. SAS soldiers were involved in a gun battle in which 8 IRA men were killed during a bomb attack on the village's police station.
Within the past hour, President George Bush has signed a bill staving off the United States budget crisis for 10 days. Now Congress must agree where to make cuts in government services to reduce the country's escalating deficit.
Now the hard part begins. Congress has just over a week to get on with the real business of working out exactly who's going to lose out in the 5-year, $500 billion deficit-cutting plan it's just passed.
The good times are gone. The times when you can fool around with all those numbers in your reconciliation, when you can call in those smart guys and say, hey, did you used to work on the budget committee? Yeah. Do you know how to fix this so I don't have to do anything hard? And they say, sure do. Well, that isn't going to work.
Like it or not, tax increases are on the way.
The reality is, if you vote for this, you're putting yourself on record in favor of the proposition that what this country needs as we teeter on the brink of a recession is a $150 billion tax increase.
And that just weeks before midterm congressional elections.
The American people want leadership, not speeches. They may disagree with us. They may vote against us. But they have children, and they have grandchildren. And if we don't act now, when?
In the next 10 days, Congress will have to face up to the legacy of the spend now, pay later 80s.
Tonight, we reap the bitter harvest of a decade of national indulgence.
In the new proposal, cuts in public health care won't be as savage as in earlier plans. President Bush will have to decide whether to accept a Democrat-inspired plan in which the rich bear the brunt. If he doesn't, it'll be back to square one.
Despite worldwide protests over the killings in Israel's occupied territories, there's been more fighting. Overnight, a taxi driver was shot dead, apparently in revenge for the shooting of more than 20 Palestinian protesters by Israeli security forces yesterday. 140 people have now been arrested, and there have been strikes and violent demonstrations in Jerusalem and in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. Our Middle East correspondent, Michael Macmillan, reports.
Retaliation last night in Jerusalem. The body of a Jewish taxi driver shot through the head. The method is unusual. Jews have been the victims of Palestinian attacks many times before, but invariably they have been stabbed. This may underline the fact that Palestinians have guns and know how to use them. In Jerusalem this morning, the Muslim Grand Mufti became the latest victim of the violence. He was overcome by tear gas and taken to hospital, but is not thought to have been seriously hurt. The trouble has spread to the streets of Israel proper, and not just in the occupied West Bank and Gaza. In Nazareth this morning, its normally peaceful streets were littered with barricades. Families were on the streets as missiles were thrown at the Israeli forces, and they replied with tear gas and plastic bullets. Outside the Israeli Prime Minister's home, a demonstration by Jews who accused their own forces of a gross overreaction at the Temple Mount yesterday.
We think that however much the police might have been provoked and however much we condemn the use of stoning and violence against the people who came there to pray, the reaction was quite out of proportion. Nowhere in the world is a demonstration dispersed by immediate resort to live bullets and ammunition.
As this street violence continues, Arabs have called a two-day strike in mourning. Most of the funerals of the victims have yet to take place. Curfews have been imposed in much of the occupied West Bank and Gaza as the Israelis brace themselves for more trouble. Michael Macmillan, BBC News in the Middle East.
Iraq has condemned the killings in Jerusalem as a heinous crime which provoked the feelings of Arabs everywhere. President Saddam Hussein has declared 3 days of mourning to honor what he called the souls of the martyrs. In New York, the United Nations Security Council is considering what action it should now take.
That the Security Council was meeting was a coincidence, and one that the Palestine Liberation Organization was swift to exploit. Their representative wanted a special commission dispatched to Israel immediately, a way of locking the Palestine problem into the UN machinery. The PLO argument was that the Security Council should act as swiftly as it had done over Iraq.
We do not understand how oil in the Gulf can be valued more highly by you than Palestinian blood and Muslim rights in shrines.
Although UN sentiment is running against Israel, the task for the Council is to find a course of action acceptable to the United States, which in the past has been reluctant to see Israel embarrassed. The Israeli position, strongly restated, is that only Israel has responsibility for security within its territories. And from Tel Aviv has come the argument that the Jerusalem incident was pre-planned.
But I must say that what we had here was a deliberate, violent provocation. We have no doubt about it whatsoever. We had calls for the Muslim faithful, for the fundamentalists, to assemble well in advance of this rioting, not on a Muslim holiday, but on a Jewish holiday. We had stockpiling of rocks hours, in fact 24 hours before this incident.
Israel says the incident was deliberately planned to divert international attention away from the Gulf. The shooting of so many Arabs, so goes this argument, was regrettable but unavoidable, because Israeli lives were put at risk by the determined assault upon them. It's a version of events which has attracted little sympathy, even from Israel's traditional supporters.
I do think it's fair to say that Israel needs to be better prepared and to exercise restraint in handling disturbances of this nature.
There have been protest demonstrations in Jordan, but the fear of the United States will be that public opinion in other Arab countries may also become aroused. If that happens, it could offer Saddam Hussein an opportunity to exploit Arab hostility to Israel and try to split the unusual coalition of Arab and Western nations which is ranged against him.
The Conservative Conference has opened in Bournemouth with a strong attack on the opposition from the party chairman, Kenneth Baker. He described Neil Kinnock as a contortionist and Labour as the party of high taxation. And Mr Baker came up with his own election slogan. In 91 or 92, the government will still be blue. Our political correspondent Lance Price is in Bournemouth.
Mr Baker gave the conference the kind of upbeat message he was looking for. He told the party it had the vision to win an election whenever it might come. But he knows that there are serious hurdles in the government's path, so both he and Mrs Thatcher have been trying to dampen down talk of an election as early as next June. Prime Minister, the last time she was here was for the conference that set the party on course for an early election victory in 1987. Many representatives are hoping for a repeat performance this week, but this morning Mrs Thatcher was giving nothing away.
Everyone's talking about dates except me. I'm not even thinking about it yet. There's far too much else to do.
First to the conference bookstall, where she chose a volume by her favourite predecessor, Winston Churchill, but found herself short of small change. With Europe still on everyone's mind, somebody suggested paying in ecus.
There is no such thing, I'm afraid, except as a measure, not actually as a currency yet. We're trying to get it as a currency.
This morning, the conference welcomed the first step, entry to the ERM. The industry secretary hit back at Labour's claim to have embraced the market and their charge that the government has no industrial policy.
Like a reluctant Weight Watcher compulsively reaching for the cream cakes, Labour still finds state control irresistible. Our policy is to set industry free, to create wealth for all our citizens.
But it was Kenneth Baker who brought the conference to life, dismissing accusations that the government was playing politics with interest rates and claiming Labour were masking their real intentions on public spending.
Labour's fingers will have to reach deep into the pockets of every taxpayer. Tax and spend, spend and tax. The Labour habits of yesterday would be the Labour policies of tomorrow.
The Conservatives, he said, offered freedom, opportunity and choice, a vision that would give them victory whenever an election might come.
We will win because time and again we've shown the determination to translate that vision of freedom into bettering the lives of the British people. Time and again we've shown the conviction to hold fast to this vision of freedom when others doubted and scorned.
In more sober surroundings on the conference fringe, the debate over Europe is continuing apace. Michael Heseltine, in a speech being delivered now, welcomes British membership of the exchange rate mechanism, but warns against Mrs Thatcher's idea of opening the community's doors to Eastern Europe. And in the same building at the same time, Nicholas Ridley, now a backbencher too, is warning against monetary union, saying a single European currency would be a disaster.
Well, joining me now from Bournemouth is the Trade and Industry Secretary, Peter Lilly. Good morning, Mr Lilly. Bearing in mind the fact that you're the 7th Secretary of State for Trade and Industry in 7 years, what are you going to make your priorities, and do you think you'll have time to carry them out?
Well, I have to beware of the fact that the life expectancy of Secretaries of State seems rather short, but my priorities will be to ensure that we have the strongest possible, freest possible, most competitive possible industry that this country can have, and that we outstrip our neighbours in Europe as we have done during the 80s.
You're not a great fan, are you, of economic and monetary union? Are you worried about the prospects for British industry now that we've joined the exchange rate mechanism?
I'm not a great fan of Mr Delors' plans for imposing EMU on all countries of Europe, but I am a great supporter of the Chancellor, and the conference today warmly welcomed his decision to cut interest rates and peg the pound. And business too welcomes the fact that we're now pegging the pound and increasing the stability that they'll have across the exchanges.
But is a 1% cut in interest rates going to be enough to stave off recession?
Well, as I spelled out, we can be sure that inflation will come down. When it comes down, John will be able to cut interest rates further, and the recession won't be there won't be a recession, I hope, but the slowdown won't be anything like the recession we saw at the beginning of the 80s.
Are you worried that the strong pound is going to hit the competitiveness of British industry?
Well, we've now fixed the range within which the pound can move, and everybody knows now, if they're in business and exporting, that they can't let their costs rise more rapidly than their competitors on the continent. that's going to bring inflation down fairly rapidly, I judge, because people will not want to price themselves, their products and their workers out of jobs.
Would you also judge it could possibly mean an increase in unemployment?
I would hope that they would respond by not pricing themselves and their products and their employees out of work, and so that they will avoid a rise in unemployment, and that means bringing inflation and cost rises down very rapidly indeed.
Now, Labour last week at Blackpool had the big idea, as it's being known, of education and training. How concerned are you that the average German worker has 2 to 3 times as much training as his British counterpart?
That's why we've introduced a whole range of measures, most of them, I have to say, opposed originally by the trades unions and the Labour Party, to overcome this great gap in vocational education which used to exist in this country. And now, happily, we have begun to plug that gap very effectively indeed. I'm delighted if it's now going to have the support of the Labour Party.
A survey by Gallup this morning suggested that only 2% of the public could put a name to your photograph. Does that worry you, the low profile?
I got here by being wholly unknown, and I don't intend to start a cult of personality from now onwards, but I'm interested to meet these 2 people in 100 who do know me.
Perhaps it was a bad photograph. Thank you very much, Peter Lilly, for joining us.
Thank you.
The Conservatives also discussed the family this morning, and there was strong support for mothers who choose to stay at home to bring up their children. The government is considering helping them with tax relief or increased benefits, but there were no specific pledges. However, the Minister with responsibility for family matters, Angela Rumbold, said the status of a mother who stayed at home should be the same as the woman who started up her own business.
Conservatives have traditionally seen themselves as the party of the family, but their political opponents say that's just a facade, that it's the Thatcher years which have seen such a marked increase in family breakdown and in the number of children whose parents are divorced or aren't married. Tax relief on workplace nurseries was introduced in this year's budget, but many Tories believe the emphasis is wrong, that the government should be doing more to encourage mothers to stay at home.
All we seem to be able to offer is tax relief on daycare, a modern obscenity of small children often being dragged across towns and dumped at 8 o'clock in the morning and collected at 6 p.m. in the evening.
But Home Office Minister of State Angela Rumbold hinted there might soon be help for mothers who wanted to stay at home.
In my view, the status of a woman at home with her children is and should be the equivalent of one who is starting up her own business, because bringing up the next generation is a new business.
Clearly, Mrs. Rumbold is considering whether there should be financial help for mothers at home, either through tax relief or benefit changes.
Well, currently, we're working very hard on a number of ideas. I can't say exactly which one of those is going to be successful, but I'm hoping that one of them will be.
Mrs. Rumbold would like to make this a government commitment, but she could find it difficult to convince the Treasury, who are in no mood to sanction extra spending.
A dockyard worker who's developed leukemia after working for 10 years on nuclear submarines is claiming damages against the Ministry of Defence. It's being seen as a test case. The man's lawyer says it's the first time the MOD has been threatened with such an action in the civil court. The MOD says of similar claims for compensation that none has gone to court and no money has been paid.
Until the early 80s, British nuclear submarines were routinely taken to Chatham for refitting. Rudy Molinari was one of hundreds of fitters who worked on them at the Royal Dockyards. An otherwise fit man of 36, he's now being treated for leukemia, which he says was caused by 10 years' exposure to radiation while working on the nuclear reactors of submarines.
You see other fitters down there, other trades working down there, fitters who've been working there before I came along. They all seemed quite well. And don't forget, they said that it was considered a safe dose to take.
And what makes you think it's not now?
Because of what's happened to me now.
He says there's no family history of cancer, and as an amateur bodybuilder, he's always taken a special care of himself. He says he was exposed to radiation limits, which, although at the time were thought safe, have now been reduced by the MOD.
Leukemia for a chap of Mr. Molinari's age at 36 is very, very unusual. And from the work that was carried out after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs on the survivors, it's clear for this kind of dose, for this type of leukemia at his age, it's very clear that the case, in all probability, was caused by the radiation.
And there's concern for his children. Studies elsewhere have suggested that the offspring of radiation workers may also be at risk. The 450 men at Chatham who worked with Rudy Molinari are now anxiously waiting to see the outcome of his case.
The new plant at Sellafield in Cumbria, designed to reprocess spent nuclear fuel, could lose more than £2 billion, according to a report commissioned by environmentalists. They say the cost of decommissioning the plant will outweigh any profits it makes, and that Parliament and the public have been misled.
According to today's report, the new thermal oxide reprocessing plant at Sellafield is bankrupting British nuclear fuels. Rising costs and dwindling interest in nuclear power by the private sector are conspiring to make the plant, known by its initials as Thorpe, technically insolvent even before construction finishes. Permission to build Thorpe at Sellafield, then called Windscale, was given after the Marathon Windscale inquiry 13 years ago. At the time, objections to the plant were on mainly environmental grounds. BNFL took the view that once arguments about safety had been resolved, justification for Thorpe would be that it was going to be immensely profitable. But the authors of today's study say the costs don't add up and that the plant is already a white elephant.
There is no actual need to reprocess fuel, and some countries like Sweden and probably Spain are in fact going to take it to direct long-term disposal. But even in this country where we're reprocessing the fuel, in fact it's being stockpiled and not used, simply because it's so expensive. And therefore there's no economic logic today for Sellafield in particular.
The basic facts of the case are quite clear. We're building a plant which will start up in 1992. The cost to us is £1,800 million. We already have £5,000 million worth of orders for the first 10 years, plus other orders after that first 10-year period when the plant will have paid for itself. There's absolutely no question in our mind. It's viable, it's going to make money, and that's the business that we're in.
The report says that existing contracts to reprocess spent nuclear fuel from power stations in Japan, Germany and Britain will not cover Sellafield's costs, nor do they allow for the costs of making and keeping the installation safe at the end of its useful life. Those decommissioning charges would add many millions to the final account.
In the city, the renewed tension in the Middle East after yesterday's killings in Jerusalem has pushed oil prices up again. At 1 o'clock, Brent crude was selling at close to $39 a barrel, a rise of more than $1. The 100-share index was down 48 points as investors tried to make a quick profit following yesterday's gains. And the pound had settled back slightly against the German mark, but it was steady against a weak dollar. The Leeds Building Society has announced that it's to cut its interest rates to 14.5%. The comedian Richard Murdoch, famous for his double act with Arthur Askey on the 30s radio programme Bandwagon, has died. He was 83. He was playing golf with friends this morning when he collapsed and died. Still working in radio at the time of his death, Richard Murdoch may be best remembered for the long-running show Much Binding in the Marsh.
Murdoch had always wanted to be an entertainer. His first job, a concert party in Weston-super-Mare. But it was radio that made his name.
Come on and make a trip upon the bandwagon. It's a wild voice.
Broadcasting House, the BBC's London headquarters. Dickie Murdoch and Arthur Askey convinced listeners they lived in a flat on the roof. Their show Bandwagon was launched in 1938, the first regular weekly comedy, and the audience loved it.
Once again, Bandwagon brazenly presents Chestnut Corner. Where do the motorhomes come from? China. What part of China? Hong Kong.
Murdoch was really the straight man. Askey dubbed him Stinker, and the name stuck. Other smash hits followed. Much Binding in the Marsh with Sam Coster and Kenneth Horne.
How did you know it was a Roman? He had belum, 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 believe below, below written on him. Whereabouts was it written on him? He had belum, belum above the belt and below, below, below. Oh, Murdoch, it's not true, is it? No.
And in the 60s, he was back again, this time as one of the men from the ministry. But television had by then come of age, and Murdoch didn't much like it. He ended his years with regular guest appearances and seaside shows, one of the last of the great wartime radio comics.
Richard Murdoch, who died this morning. 50 years ago today, John Lennon was born, and in just over an hour's time, one of his best-known songs, Imagine, will be broadcast to millions of people all over the world. In Lennon's birthplace, Liverpool, there's been a memorial service at the Cavern Walks, on the spot where the Beatles first tasted success.
Liverpool City, which once demolished the Cavern Club, where the Beatles first made it big, and had to build a replica, is nowadays keen to pay its birthday respects to one of its best-known citizens. At today's memorial service, local dignitaries rub shoulders with hardened fans and a circle of familiar and not-so-familiar friends. Paul McCartney has chosen to release his version of Birthday, the first Lennon-McCartney song he's released here as a single since the Beatles split.
I wrote it with John. We wrote it on the off chance one night. We didn't have a, so we came into the studio, we didn't have a song. You know, it's just a little nod and a wink to an old friend.
How much John Lennon would have enjoyed the tributes is another question. He remained sharply political and eccentric and a nightmare for television producers.
Half the people watching this are going to be saying, oh, what's he saying, what's he saying? You know, that you are being run by people who are insane and you don't know.
John Lennon was not an establishment figure. He was very much anti-establishment, anarchic even, you know, and I mean, this is the guy who 4 years after receiving his MB from the Queen returned it. I don't think he'd even gone to his own funeral. So he may have expected all this fuss. I think he would have found it slightly distasteful.
I've been told, baby, you've been bold, I won't be your fool no more. Yeah, I won't be your fool no more, mama. Not for nothing have I been doing this for 100 years.
John Lennon, the memory lives on. And now at 27 minutes past 1, the main news again. One of the 2 men killed by soldiers last night in Northern Ireland is believed to have been a top IRA gunman. 3 more Palestinians have been killed in Jerusalem. Israel is braced for more violence. And Kenneth Baker tells Conservatives in Bournemouth an election in 91 or 92 will still leave the government blue. And that's all this Tuesday lunchtime. From the 1 o'clock news on the BBC, a very good afternoon.
Hello. Windy, cloudy weather for the rest of the week. Yesterday's fickle sunshine in the south has decamped to France, while at the other end of Europe, you can see some pretty angry thunderstorms in western parts of the Mediterranean, that particular one threatening the Balearics. But it's these weather fronts here affecting the British Isles for the next few days. Now we're watching this front at the moment for minor wriggles to develop and run quickly along its length, giving renewed bursts of rain, especially in northern and western parts of Britain. The high pressure giving many southern and eastern parts of Britain essentially dry weather for the next 24 hours. But one wave will develop on this front and rush quickly eastwards across Northern Ireland, southern Scotland and northern England tomorrow, bringing renewed wind and rain to those areas. And yet another wriggle will develop, we think, on Thursday. This might be more important. This might will give very windy, wet weather to the north and west of Britain during Friday and Saturday. Just at the moment, not too much rain on our radar at the moment, mainly in the west and in the north there. Much more up over central Scotland though at the moment. But meanwhile, much brighter but very showery weather is getting into the far north of Scotland there. Some of these showers pretty heavy, hail too in places, but many southern and eastern parts staying dry, rather cloudy, just a little bit of brightness in places. But a windy day, especially in the north, breezy too in the south as well, but in the north, getting up to gale force in many places. Those are the average wind speeds at 4 o'clock this afternoon. Temperatures underscored by those winds, typically 14 Celsius, 57 Fahrenheit, no better anywhere than about 15 Celsius, 59 degrees Fahrenheit. Tonight, showers continuing in the north, rain and drizzle in many western districts, mainly dry in eastern districts, but with all that wind and rain, a mild night, temperatures no lower typically than 10 Celsius, in the glens perhaps 5 Celsius, 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Tomorrow, another burst of quite heavy rain spreading eastwards across Northern Ireland, southern Scotland and northern England, with brighter weather getting into central Scotland later on in the day.
Tuesday evening on BBC1, we're in pursuit of the trivial at 7. Then at 7:30, some tough talking in EastEnders.
Right, well, if they won't leave of their own accord, it's up to us to change their minds about staying.
At 8 in May to December, Zoe's driving Alec crazy. Go. Mrs. Wembley's on the up at 8:30.
Oh,
now, you're very naughty. You shouldn't have.
It's a 5-speed egg whisk.
In the Paradise Club at 9:30, Frank's behaviour is causing concern.
Frank Kane is a renegade. He's even renounced the address of Father. You mean you're going to spy on him? If Father Kane has nothing to hide, there'll be no case to answer.
In Film 90 at 10:20, stand by for mayhem with RoboCop 2. Stay on course this Tuesday night with BBC1.
In 20 minutes, there's another round of picture puzzles and Pelmanism for Foursquare competitors. First, temptation teases Harold in today's edition of Neighbours.